My dad left 15 years ago, leaving my mom and me struggling. Now he's back with an outrageous request. They say that time heals all wounds. But I'm not sure I believe that anymore. When my dad left us, he didn't just walk out the door, he walked out of my life. No explanations, no goodbyes, just gone. One day he was there, sitting at the dinner table, grumbling about work, and the next day, he wasn't. I was 13 years old at the time, old enough to feel the weight of his absence, but not old enough to understand why he left. It's been nearly 15 years since that day, and still, the memory feels fresh, like a wound that never quite scabbed over. My mom, bless her, waited for him for years. At first, she was convinced he'd come back, that he'd made some sort of mistake, or had a crisis of some kind, and eventually, he'd realize that we were still here, waiting for him to return and make everything right again. She never said those words outright, but I could see it in her eyes, the hope, the lingering expectation, even when months turned into years. I'll never forget the way she would still set a place for him at the dinner table. Long after it became clear he wasn't coming back. It was a small thing, but it said so much. I think, in some way, she didn't want to believe he was truly gone. And as a kid, I clung to that hope too. I would lie awake at night, imagining what it would be like if he walked through the front door again, smiling like nothing had happened, explaining it all away with some excuse that would make sense to me. But that day never came. At first, I was angry at him for leaving, for abandoning us without a word, for making my mom cry herself to sleep in her bedroom while I pretended not to hear. The worst part was that I had no answers. He didn't leave a note, didn't call or write, didn't give any indication of why he left or where he had gone. It was like he had just evaporated from our lives. And in his place, there was only silence. The silence was the hardest part. It filled every corner of our house, every conversation. We didn't talk about him much after the first few months. My mom, stoic as ever, did her best to keep things normal for me, to maintain some sense of stability. But we both knew that something had broken, something essential, and no matter how hard we tried, it couldn't be fixed. The years passed slowly. My mom eventually stopped setting a place for him at dinner, and we settled into a new normal. She got a job at a local bank, working long hours to make ends meet. I tried my best to help out around the house, though I was still a kid, struggling to understand why my father had abandoned us. I remember watching her come home from work, her face tired, her eyes heavy with the weight of the day, and feeling a deep sense of guilt. I was just a kid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had been better, smarter, more helpful, more something, maybe he wouldn't have left. But that kind of thinking eats away at you after a while. So, eventually, I buried my feelings. I pretended I didn't care that he was gone. I told myself that we were better off without him, that my mom and I could make it on our own. And we did. I grew up, went to college, got a decent job. Life moved on, even though the wound of his disappearance never really healed. Then, about 3 months ago, out of nowhere, I got a phone call. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't have answered, but something made me pick up that day. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, when I heard his voice on the other end of the line, my heart nearly stopped. "Hey, kid," he said, as if no time had passed. As if he hadn't abandoned me and my mom all those years ago. As if we were just picking up a conversation from the day before. I didn't know what to say. I could barely process that it was him, my dad asterisk, after all these years. I hadn't heard his voice in over a decade, but there it was, unmistakable, coming through the receiver like a ghost from my past. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. He didn't offer any explanation. He didn't apologize or try to explain why he had left. Instead, he told me he wanted to talk, to reconnect. He said he missed me, missed us, and that he had some things he needed to explain. But what caught me off guard wasn't his sudden reappearance, it was what he really wanted. It took a few minutes, but eventually, he got to the point. He needed money. The shock of hearing from him was one thing. But this was something else entirely. My father, the man who had disappeared from my life without a trace, who hadn't bothered to check in on us for 15 years, was now calling me to ask for help. Financial help, no less. He tried to make it sound casual, almost like it wasn't a big deal. But I could hear the desperation in his voice. He was in trouble, deep trouble, and he needed me to bail him out. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to him talk about his debts, his bad luck, his plans to get back on his feet if only he could get some help. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. All I could think about was the fact that he had left us, left me, and now he had the audacity to ask for something from me. In that moment, every emotion I had buried over the years came flooding back. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, it all hit me at once. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had hurt us, how much pain he had caused. But instead, I sat there in stunned silence, barely able to process what was happening. When I didn't respond right away, he kept talking. He tried to make small talk, asking about my life, about my mom. I could hear him grasping for some semblance of normalcy. But it was too late. There was no normal between us anymore. Whatever relationship we had once had was long gone, destroyed the day he walked out of our lives without a word. I don't remember exactly how the conversation ended. I must have made some excuse to get off the phone, told him I needed to think about it. But the truth was, I didn't need to think about it at all. There was no way I was going to give him what he wanted. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for what felt like hours, staring blankly at my computer screen. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call my mom, to tell her what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She had finally moved on from him, at least. I thought she had, and I didn't want to reopen old wounds. But I couldn't keep it from her forever. A few days later, I went to visit her, and I told her everything. I expected her to be angry, or maybe even sad, but instead, she just looked tired, tired of waiting, tired of hoping for something that would never come. She didn't say much, just nodded as I spoke, her expression unreadable. When I was done, she sat in silence for a long time, and I wondered if she was thinking about all those years she had spent waiting for him to come back. Waiting for answers that never came. Finally, she sighed and said something I'll never forget. He's not the man we once knew. He's someone else now, and we don't owe him anything. It took me a while to fully understand the weight of her words. But she was right. The man who had called me wasn't the father I remembered from my childhood. He wasn't the man who had taught me how to ride a bike, who had taken me fishing on Saturday mornings, who had once been the center of our little family. That man was gone. In his place was someone I barely recognized, someone who had chosen to leave us behind, and now, all these years later, wanted something from me. After that conversation with my mom, I made my decision. I wasn't going to help him. I wasn't going to give him money, or offer him a way back into my life. He had made his choice. And now, so had I. I didn't call him back. I didn't need to. He had shown me exactly who he was. And I wasn't going to let him hurt me again. It wasn't easy, closing the door on someone who was once such an important part of my life, but it was necessary. I had spent too many years wondering why he had left. Too many years waiting for an explanation that would never come. I couldn't keep waiting. In the weeks that followed, I thought a lot about forgiveness. People talk about how important it is, how it's supposed to set you free. But I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Some wounds go too deep. Some betrayals cut too sharp. And sometimes, the only way to move forward is to accept that you'll never get the closure you're looking for. I've come to terms with the fact that my father will never be the person I once knew. The person I once loved. He made his choices, and I've made mine. Life doesn't always give you the answers you want, but it gives you the chance to decide who you want to be in the face of those unanswered questions. For me, I choose to move forward without him. In the months after I made the decision not to call him back, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. It wasn't the kind of immediate relief you get when you fix something that's been weighing on you. It was subtler than that. Like a slow release of tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying all these years. I think, for the first time since he left, I stopped waiting, stopped hoping for answers, for closure, for anything from him. It was as though the chains that had tethered me to the past had finally loosened. And I could move forward without looking over my shoulder. My mom and I never spoke about him again. We didn't need to. She had given me the strength I needed to close that chapter. And in her quiet way, she had shown me that moving on didn't always mean forgiving or forgetting, it just meant choosing yourself over the pain. That was something I had to learn for myself. I threw myself into my life after that. I focused on my career, my friends, the things that brought me joy. I stopped wondering what my father was doing, whether he had figured out a way to fix his own mess. That was his burden to carry, not mine. He had tried to make me part of his story again, but I wasn't going to let him pull me back into that darkness. Occasionally, I would catch myself thinking about the father I once knew, the man I loved as a child. The memories would float up, those early morning fishing trips. The way he'd laugh at my terrible jokes. The way he'd hug me when I was scared. And for a while, it hurt to think about those things because they reminded me of everything I'd lost. But eventually, even those memories began to change. They stopped feeling like reminders of betrayal and more like pieces of a life that once was. I could appreciate them for what they were. Fragments of good times. Moments of love that, while no longer a part of my present, had still shaped me. I didn't forgive him, but I forgave myself for holding on to the hope for so long. I think that's the hardest part, accepting that it's okay to let go of the people who hurt you. Even if they're family, even if they were once everything to you. So, as the years rolled on, I let go. I didn't look back, and in doing so, I found peace, not the kind of peace that comes from answers or apologies, but the kind that comes from knowing you've made the right decision for yourself. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Choose the path that allows us to keep moving forward. Even when the past tries to pull us back. And I chose to keep walking, leaving the ghosts of that chapter behind me, where they belonged.